Welcome to the London Commercial Offices podcast with me, your host, Steve Berridge, Managing Director at Fidgens Cost Management. This is a podcast where we share the stories, career paths, lessons and insights from some of the industry's most influential people. Anything contained within our podcast should not be considered professional advice, and if you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe or follow buttons to ensure you don't miss any of the amazing guests we've got coming up. It also really helps us grow the show. Thanks. Today we're joined by Sam Wallis, CEO at GIA, a leading expert in daylight, sunlight and rights of light. GIA takes a contextual approach to planning and development, contributing to major construction schemes. They also offer services in building surveying, party wall, enabling matters, solar and wind analysis. So, without further ado, Sam, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I'm both excited and nervous to go through this process, as I'm not sure I've paused very often to think about my career. It'll be a sort of maybe a therapeutic process for me as well.
I should say we charge £200.
Sounds like very good value.
So you'll know from previous episodes that we like to start right back at the beginning. So how far back are we going today? Are we going to a school age, Sam? Uni? Where do you want to start?
Let's go school age. Sort of partly for my own interest, to be honest. It's not a part of my life that I necessarily reflect on that often. I grew up in Southport. Was in the northwest. It's sort of halfway between Liverpool and Preston. So I went to an all-boys high school there, which was fine. It was a relatively unremarkable school. Had some great friends that went there, people that I'm sort of still fortunate enough to be friendly with now. I finished my GCSEs at Birkdale High School and then sort of had a bit of a decision to make in terms of where I went to do my A-levels. I was resolved to do A-levels, and I sort of, with the aim of going to university. I was sort of chatting with my dad about where I might go and do them, and he suggested that I might want to go and do them at a school on the Isle of Man.
That's okay. Where did that come from?
So I'll tell you what I know.
Right.
and sort of the exact number, I've never fully fact-checked myself, but lots of my family went to that school. So I was sort of told I was the 13th person from my family to go to the school. Off the top of my head, I can sort of think of 7 or 8, but I've never fully figured out or counted the full 13. But my dad went there. Both my uncles went there. Great uncles went there. They went from all the way from prep school through to do their equivalent of GCSEs and A-levels,
Yep.
O-levels, or whatever they were at the time. And Dad sort of, suggested that I might want to go and do that. It had never really been in my awareness of something that I might want to go and do. So I went over and looked at the school and loved it. And so I ended up going there to do my A-levels. At the same time, my mum got a job over there. We bought a small house. So my mum worked during the week, and then often she would fly home to the sort of family house in Southport.
Oh, so you kept 2 family homes running at the same time?
Yeah, and leave me on the Isle of Man.
How old?
As a sort of 16, 17, 18-year-old kid, I had a really good time.
I can imagine.
It was a complete, going from a sort of a comprehensive all-boys school, which was, not enormously rough, but, wasn't like the school on the Isle of Man. It was a completely different lifestyle, and I absolutely loved it. I loved the Isle of Man, and I loved going to that school. It was just the sort of lifestyle. The school itself was really interesting, really old. Loads of history around it. I kind of felt that in relatives' names on the wall, and then we'd water ski at the weekends, and it was just great. A fantastic place. I absolutely loved it, and I also discovered a love of rugby at that school, and sort of rugby has then kind of given me quite a lot, I suppose, until I stopped playing in my, I don't know, I guess early 30s once I had a family. I was a bang average rugby player, is how I would describe myself. Sort of, I could turn up and play and do a sort of decent job, but there was never any
Career prospect.
Never any danger of me making any money out of it.
I mean, I have to say we've had quite a few people on the show.
I know.
Started off as Well, I was going to be a full-time rugby player, but
Yeah,
I couldn't. So I thought I'd come into the built environment.
yeah. I mean, same. I was going to be a rugby player, a full-time rugby player, but I was absolutely nowhere near good enough. So it was never. There was never a prospect of that happening. But nonetheless, it gave me a lot, and I'll sort of maybe as we kind of go through my sort of journey, kind of touch on some of the things that rugby's given me, because it's not necessarily rugby itself, but it's team sports, and I sort of feel quite strongly about qualities that team sports have given me throughout my sort of adult life.
So was this Isle of Man for AS and A levels?
Yeah, so I went there from 1998 until 2000.
And in terms of the ones that you picked, I'm thinking, was it geography, estate management, the typical kind of built environment foundations, or?
You would think that, Steve, but instead I did chemistry, biology and maths. And I did chemistry, biology and maths because I wanted to be a doctor. My granddad was a doctor, and I'd always sort of thought that was something that I was quite interested in. And I did a bit of work experience at the hospital, and you can do this sort of pre-med course at Nottingham University that I went and did. But weirdly, actually, through the sort of work experience and other bits, it didn't really light my fire in terms of what I wanted to do. And my dad's he's retired now, but my dad's a surveyor. He was a chartered GP surveyor. And so it was always sort of, in my sort of thinking of something that, existed as a career.
You knew about it. It was on the periphery.
I knew about it. Yeah. I knew about it, and sort of, I'd spoken to him about it quite a lot, and he always said that he found his job interesting, and, he was clearly keen to push is the wrong word, but I think, he always expressed that it was a career he enjoyed. And, I think when I sort of decided to go to university and do it, I think he was sort of secretly probably quite pleased. And it was never, and whilst I ended up going to the same school as him for a bit and ultimately ended up with a similar career to him, I never felt at all like he was pushing me down that route. Maybe he did a very good subconscious job of doing it, but I never felt pressured to do it at all. After my time in the Isle of Man, which as I said before, I thoroughly enjoyed, I went off to university at Heriot Watt in Edinburgh. So I went there from 2000 until 2004. So it was a 4-year course actually in Scotland, but no sandwich, so no year in industry. It was 4 years straight. Again, I absolutely loved my time at university. I did a degree in building surveying.
So you're doing your AS levels, biology, chemistry, and maths. They went well, in terms of.
Yeah, I sort of average again.
Average.
I think average. I think if I'm being honest with myself, the change of lifestyle from comprehensive all boys school to a mixed private school, which was a boarding school. There were a few day pupils, of which I was one, but there weren't that many day pupils. It was a completely different lifestyle, and and I had a good time.
Kid in a sweet shop.
It's maybe the way of describing it. I did well at my GCSEs, and I didn't particularly apply myself enormously for my A levels. And then we'll kind of come on to it, but then I kind of sort of had a change of approach for my degree, and did apply myself for that.
So in terms of then the choice to go and pursue a building surveying degree, in terms of, was that you finished AS levels, realised that medicine wasn't for you? Okay, head up now. What do we look at? What do we do? Okay, now let's pursue building surveying. Was that the kind of the mindset?
Yeah, I sort of, it wasn't a sort of career choice that I had a sort of burning desire to do. I'd never sort of envisaged that as a career when I was growing up. I mean, I guess sort of like everyone, I'd kind of flitted between, I don't know, I had a sort of a vet at one point, and then a doctor, and sort of various other kind of careers, similar careers to that. I think I wanted to be a zoologist for a while. But I never sort of thought to myself, I'm desperate to be a chartered surveyor. That's just me, and you'll sort of, as we go through our conversation, it's a career that I thoroughly enjoy, and so it just wasn't what I saw myself doing. Sort of teenage me. So when I'd made sort of that decision in my GCSEs that I think I wanted to be a doctor, and I'd set up my A levels to do that, and then after a sort of I realised it wasn't something that I necessarily held a burning desire to do anymore. I think it's something I picked because an excellent career, and it, I thought it sounded good. But the more I learned about it, the more I thought, I don't think it's necessarily for me. And so, a surveyor was something I was aware of, and I didn't necessarily have another career in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of chatting to my dad and sort of thinking about what else might be out there as an option. Surveying was something that I knew as a career because my dad had done it. And so it was a sort of, almost a kind of natural choice because it was familiar, and I sort of, I knew what it involved, and I knew that my dad enjoyed it. And frankly, I'd enjoyed my sort of childhood and family life. And so maybe somewhere again in your sort of subconscious, you associate the two and think, well, I had a good life, and maybe if I therefore follow surveying, I can offer that to my kids, and I'll have a good life as well. So
I relate to that similarly. Bizarrely, I did okay at GCSE. I then did less than okay at AS level because I was focused on other things.
Yeah.
And then kind of, it was at that point I kind of said, well, okay, what do I want to do? And obviously my father's a QS, as you said. Great upbringing. I did work experience. I remember doing work experience at a very young age, in the office with a scale ruler. It's kind of and at that point in time, you don't really know many other careers, apart from the obvious ones. And for me, it was, okay, well, let's do that. But once I had that in my mind, I was focused. And then suddenly, I was a very good student because it was something that I was interested in.
Exactly the same, Steve. I don't even know if it was a thing, but I don't remember having careers guidance. I don't remember.
No.
Yeah, I don't remember someone saying, what do you like doing? These might be the roles for you. If that existed, I don't remember it ever happening. It felt like you were almost sort of, it was down to you to figure out what existed as jobs out there. Interesting that we both sort of followed the family line of work. The sort of a vet or a doctor are very traditional roles that people know about. Being a chartered surveyor isn't not as sort of.
Well, it's not something you come across in school. It's not something that you read about in children's school books. When you're growing up. So I think it's unless to be fair, the industry has got a lot better about trying, encourage, and promote to younger kids to highlight that. You can see that in the market. But I still don't think we're there yet. There's still a lot of people that want to become vets, and I think maybe rightly or wrongly, that's because they know more about that profession at a young age. We're in Edinburgh, building surveying degree, and I love Edinburgh, but having a great time, I assume.
What a city! I stayed in halls in the first year. I didn't know anyone at all when I went to Edinburgh. And some of my school friends that I mentioned before that I'm still friendly with now, that they went to university together, and I was a little bit sort of. Some points I wish that I'd done the same thing, that I'd gone to university with them as well, and I could have done.
Why Edinburgh? Was it a pin on the map because it was far away? What drove you to pick that as a uni?
I think I applied to 4 places. So I applied to sort of the standard Reading, the University of West of England, so in Bristol.
That's where I went. Great uni.
Yeah, so somewhere else, and Edinburgh. I can't remember the 4th one, and I got offers at all of them. I think I chose Edinburgh because I was just interested in going to Edinburgh, to be honest. And I maybe in part it was being sort of, I remember sort of saying, I don't want my parents to drop in unannounced when I'm at university and stuff. So that's why I'm going to Edinburgh. I don't think I really believe that, to be honest. I think I just wanted to try a different city. I'd heard great things about Edinburgh, and I visited a couple of the different unis and just loved it. I love the city. I love the campus when I went up there. I stayed in halls in the first year, and sort of almost sort of in the first week, I met sort of 5 people that then sort of we all lived together, and we've all sort of remained friends. So after we stayed in halls in the first year, we then lived together for 3 more years in a couple of different flats around Edinburgh. I'm still friends with those guys today. In fact, we had our sort of informal 20-year university reunion last year. We all went up to Edinburgh and met up again. But yeah, we lived together in various sort of rubbish flats around Edinburgh in the city centre. The flat we sort of settled on in a place called Polworth Gardens, I think it was absolutely enormous. So the flat was, I couldn't even tell you in square feet. It must have been 2,500 square feet. It was absolutely huge. I remember bedroom was probably 6 meters by 6 meters. We had no heating, no central heating. I remember one night going to bed and waking up, and the pint of water by the side of my bed had frozen because it was that cold in there. But it was great. That sort of massive flat was loads of fun. I graduated there in 2004. The way that you sort of described it, and between how we sort of fluctuated with GCSEs and A levels and through our degrees. It was a 4-year degree in Edinburgh, but only the last year counted. Which I think they've changed that now. It was only the last year that counted. So I basically had a great time in sort of years 1 to 3, and then whilst I still had a great time in year 4, I did apply myself. I did work pretty hard, and I ended up coming away with a first. There was only 2 of us that got a first, me and one of my housemates, and we never know who got the better mark. We both resolved that we will never look. So whether he did or I did, I don't know, but I genuinely don't know between the 2 of us which one got the highest mark, and we still sort of joke about it now. But we had this pact that we wouldn't look, and we'd both just say that we came joint. So I don't know. He lives in Australia now, but yeah. So I graduated with a first from Heriot Watt, and I was proud of that because I did apply myself, and
it was almost the proof or ratification that it was the right decision. To go and pursue it. Had you walked away with a third, again, in your mind, you'd I still think, but thinking, am I going on the right path?
I was aware that I didn't try as hard as I could have done in my A-levels. And so I almost wanted to see what I could do if I did apply myself. And so if I applied myself and not got a great result, you're right, it would have probably questioned my choice and what I was doing. In applying myself and then coming out with that result, it did give me confidence that I could go into the career and think, as long as I continue to apply myself, hopefully I'll be okay. When I was at university, I didn't get a student loan. I worked instead. I worked in a bar called Frankenstein. So for anyone that's ever been to Edinburgh, there's this massive bar called Frankenstein's, and at midnight, Frankenstein comes out of the ceiling and sits up and looks around and then goes back into his cave after 5 minutes. So I worked in that bar, and I very strongly believe that some of the skills that I learned working behind a bar and waiting tables, I still apply now. And I think that, as well as team sport, I think working in a bar or a restaurant gives you an unbelievable set of skills that help you, whether it's sort of juggling tasks under pressure, whether it's the sort of dealing with customers. I think that you can pick up so many brilliant skills from those kind of roles. And, the CVs that I come across, I do notice if people have had work experience in those kind of areas. And, I wonder if sometimes people think I'm applying for a graduate role and I haven't got any work experience in surveying. I think there's tremendous skills you can pick up through team sports and through working in hospitality, because there's just so much that's transferable to any job. I was having this conversation with someone at work, and we were sort of talking about teachable moments and when certain things happen throughout your life that change the way that you deal with things. I had this moment, and it makes me squirm inside when I think about it.
This isn't a video podcast, but you can see that on your face. for people listening.
It still makes me feel uncomfortable now. You sort of rotated around between whether you were put behind the bar or whether you were put on waiting tables, because it was a bar that served food, and then after a certain time they'd stop serving food and you'd go behind the bar as the bar got busier. I was waiting tables, and when you're waiting tables, everyone used to have a sort of earpiece and radio, so you could radio around and you could speak to the kitchen and so on. And you could speak to each other, which was sometimes very funny. But I remember I waited on a table of American tourists, and we used to get maybe £3 or £3.50 an hour. And I waited on this table of tourists, and at the end of it, they gave me a 65 quid tip. And I was so chuffed that with no intended malice whatsoever, I just told everyone on the radio that I've just got this massive tip and, how fantastic I am. And it went down like the proverbial sandwich you would expect it to. And of course it would. And with hindsight, I didn't, other than the fact I was just genuinely really happy. It makes me cringe now, the sort of lack of empathy for other people in the bar who, hadn't got that tip, and the people in the kitchen who didn't get tips. And it makes me feel terrible now. And I still, I still think about that probably more regularly than I should have done. And it taught me such a lesson in empathy and other people's perspectives.
Yeah, emotional intelligence.
Yeah, exactly, emotional intelligence. I was just really happy. And then as soon as I said it, and then I think the supervisor came over to me and said, that wasn't a great move.
Took it off you and split it amongst the team.
So I did actually then say, I said, I'll use it to buy everyone a drink at the end of the shift. And I did. And I bought everyone a drink at the end of the shift. And, people couldn't have been less happy to receive a drink from me.
Yeah.
Because they were all just really peed off. That was a real moment that sort of 20 years later, I still think about and think that was a really rubbish thing to do. Skills that you learn in hospitality, I think are massively important. And so, anyone that's going into a graduate role and has been struggling to get work experience at a construction firm or a surveying firm, I would say don't worry, because there's enormous skills to be picked up everywhere in every role. And if people have never had a job before, I would query that. But if people have had jobs and they've been responsible and they've held jobs for a long time, that shows qualities that I would look for.
Absolutely. And I think it shows a work ethic as well.
It does.
In looking at a young CV and seeing that, from the age of 16, they've been doing a variety of things, notwithstanding the skills that they pick up, it just shows drive. It shows ambition. It shows, they understand, the way that value is created and they're willing to put something in to get something out. I think bizarrely, I started off working in a call centre when I was really young, maybe 16, again, £2.50 an hour, whatever it was back then. And I loved it. And it was often dealing with very disgruntled people on the phone. But in terms of skill set, by the time I left that call centre, I think I was 17, 18, went off to uni, but I was running the call centre by then. And I remember at the time, the guy that owned it, Mark, kind of said, are you sure you want to go to uni? Because, there's a place for you here, you can take over the business, or, and I kind of, and again, flippantly, empathy, life lesson, I didn't laugh at him because that's not me. But I said it was almost, no, I don't want to run a call centre. I want to go and do all of this other stuff. But at the time, it was, I'd left there, and in terms of joining the real world, had spent 3 years talking to people, albeit on the phone, but talking to a lot of different people, having conversations with a lot of, trying to appease people and de-stress situations. And again, at the time, completely irrelevant to my career path, or so I thought. But actually, you now look, in a final account negotiation, when you have that emotional intelligence to see 3 steps ahead, to see where this conversation's going, course correct, so that we both end up where we want to get to. And I think it's and that comes from a real diverse set of activities. You won't pick that up going to do work experience for a QS firm when you're 17, because you just don't. You're not put in those situations. So food for thought.
I did do some work experience while I was at university. I worked one summer for an architecture firm in Liverpool. I worked very briefly for a very small sort of surveying and estate agency firm in Wigan. Actually, I think I probably did a month there until I got offered the sort of work experience role at the architecture firm. And the architecture firm, it allowed me to teach myself how to do CAD. And then we had this, I remember in the final year at university, one of the modules that we had to do was we had to draw some details at various junctions of, whether it was sort of the difference between a
floor slab and a pad. I think we did that.
Yeah, exactly. And we had to do some sort of glass fixings and various other bits. And I remember I drew them in CAD because I taught myself CAD. And I remember the lecturer saying, "Oh, you're not allowed to use CAD." And I said, "Well, why not?" And they said, "Because not everyone can do it." I thought, what a ridiculous conclusion to come to, that because I taught myself CAD and no one else had, I wasn't allowed to use it. So in the end, I just drew everything in CAD and then traced it by hand and handed it in traced. But I thought what a strange conclusion to come to, that because somebody has taught themselves a skill and not everyone else has been able to taught themselves a skill, it's unfair for them to use it. I worked at an architecture firm for the summer, and it allowed me to sort of get my kind of first taste of working in that sort of environment. It wasn't necessarily surveying, but I was going out and I was inspecting buildings, and and I was coming back and doing some CAD, and I enjoyed working there, and it gave me confirmation that I think I was going to like the career that I was about to go into. When I was at university, I interviewed for 2 companies. So I had an interview for a company called EC Harris, which are now Arcadis, but it was EC Harris in Manchester. And I had an interview for a company called Malcolm Hollis, who are now Hollis Global. And the Malcolm Hollis role was down in London. And I got offered them both. I got offered the role in Manchester, and I got offered the role in London. And because I'd been away at Edinburgh for a while, and it was a sort of 3.5-hour train journey from back home, I decided that I wanted to be a bit close to home for a while. And being sort of reasonably close to Liverpool, if ever me and my friends wanted to go for a big night out, we'd go for a big night out in Manchester. That was always the sort of destination to go, because Liverpool was sort of relatively regular night out for us. Manchester was always the big one. So I was generally sort of excited to go to Manchester anyway. So I chose Manchester. It was close to home, turned down the job at Malcolm Hollis and accepted the job at EC Harris. I started at EC Harris in, I think it was July 2004. So we sort of finished university in May time. I stayed up in Edinburgh for a month and a bit. All of my housemates and I knew that we had jobs, but all of us weren't starting till sort of middle end of summer.
So kind of a couple of months left to play before becoming grown-ups.
So I think we spent every single day down at the meadows in Edinburgh playing heads and volleys before all sort of disappearing off for our sort of to start our various careers in Edinburgh or Manchester or Northern Ireland or wherever it ended up being. So I started at EC Harris in July 2004, and I worked there for a year and a half. I didn't really enjoy my time at EC Harris. I worked with some great people. My sort of direct boss at the time was a chap called Dave Hallam. He was great, and his boss was a chap called Phil Bezic, and he was great as well. They were both great, and I liked working with them both. But I didn't really enjoy the kind of work that they were doing.
Where were you put in terms of sort of sector, and what were you working on?
Yeah, so I sat in their building surveying team, and EC Harris was predominantly a QSPM firm. Mm-hmm. The work was almost exclusively schedules of condition. So they had 2 big contracts. One was for RBS and one was for Dixon Store Group. Great clients, and and for the business, I was too junior to sort of properly understand the financials, but I'd imagine really lucrative clients for EC Harris at the time. But the job was effectively driving around UK and Ireland and inspecting Dixon's or PC World's or Curry's and RBS branches and doing stock condition surveys. And I just found it quite repetitive. There was never it didn't really feel challenging. There was no understanding of why. So you didn't see them through. You just collected the data and then moved on to the next one. And that wasn't really very fulfilling for me. I wanted to be challenged and I wanted a bit more. So I lasted 18 months there. And whilst I enjoyed the people that I worked with, I just couldn't get on with the work. And I didn't feel like it matched my ambition of what I wanted to do. And I was really thinking about, actually, after sort of maybe a year there, I was actually thinking, I don't know if this is the career for me. It doesn't.
If that's the only insight you've had into the profession at that point in time.
I can't see myself doing this for many more years, let alone kind of making a career out of it. And so I was really reflecting on whether or not this is right for me. And then sort of as fate would have it, I got a call from Malcolm Hollis, their recruiter at the time, and she said, "We've got a graduate role that's opened up in Manchester. We were suitably impressed with you first time around when we interviewed you that we thought we'd give you a call and see if you'd be interested." And so I went and met with one of the equity partners at the time, a lady called Claire Charlton, and we had a bit of a chat. And she said, are you interested? And I said, absolutely. I wasn't really enjoying the work I was doing at EC Harris. And so I thought, I'm not kind of prepared to give up on the industry at the moment. I'd worked hard at uni. So I went to Malcolm Hollis, and it was like a breath of fresh air.
And was that down in London?
No, it was in Manchester.
Okay.
So they, and that was the reason, because I turned them down and I said to them specifically, I don't want to go to London when I'd sort of been at university, and they didn't have anything in Manchester for me at the time. So when a role had opened up in Manchester, they'd obviously kept me on my details on the book somewhere, and then picked up the phone and said, we've got something in Manchester now. Are you interested? And I very much was, because, as I said, that I wasn't feeling particularly challenged at the kind of work that I was doing at EC Harris. I was very ready for a sort of more of a challenge. So I started at Malcolm Hollis January 2006. So almost exactly 18 months after I started at EC Harris. And it was a smaller team then. In Manchester, I would guess there were about 8 people maybe, and it was a completely different set of work. So I hadn't really made any particular progress on my APC at EC Harris. I'd been filling out my diary, but no one was really pushing you to do your APC.
And presumably you were just out of the office around the country most of the time.
At EC Harris, they sort of, they put me in charge of arranging the inspections for everyone. And we used to grade so for RBS, we used to grade them between A to G, I think it was. And A was, effectively a cash machine with a room behind it, and G was a call center or something else like that. And we worked on assumptions that an A would take you half a day by the time you've driven there, and a G would take you 3 days, for example. So we'd go to Bristol or London, or actually to the Isle of Man for a week, and you would fill your diary with these A's, B's, C's, and through to G's based on how long you thought they would take. So you'd get sort of 5 days worth of inspections according to your grade A to G. And then you'd go to whether it was, I remember Bristol and the Isle of Man really well. You'd go to those 2 places. You would then go as fast as you possibly could to get all of the inspections done in the week. So the idea was to get them out of the way by Wednesday.
And have a couple of days.
And then you just have Thursday and Friday to sort of enjoy wherever you were. And typically there'd be sort of 2 or 3 of you that go to those locations and do it. And then, you'd get the surveys out of the way, and then you'd just try your best to have a bit of fun in whatever city you're in. So it was good, but that side of it was good. But like I say, the people I worked with were great, and I did feel, I think Dave Hallam and Phil Beswick at the time, I think they weren't surprised when I said I'm not really feeling particularly challenged by this work, and they tried to make some changes, but I don't think it was within their gift to be able to make the changes that that I was looking for. So I went over to Malcolm Hollis, and I spent just short of 10 years there. So I got there in Jan 2006 and felt immediately happier in the work that I was doing, and it was more professional services. So it was dilapidations, it was technical due diligence, it was sort of the stuff, the real kind of meat and drink of chartered building surveyor work, and it was for big clients, so it was big fun clients. And the biggest difference that I felt was that you were trusted to take the instruction all the way through. So from nearly from day one, you spoke to the clients, you took the instructions, you opened the paper file as it was at the time, and you ran the instruction from start to finish. And that was a massive difference for me, because it just helped you understand how the industry worked. And you just couldn't get that from the work I was doing at EC Harris, because you just saw small parts of it. And now, I sort of, as I've kind of gained an experience in my career, I can go back and I can absolutely understand why the bits that I was doing at EC Harris were very important for those sorts of companies. But I was 2G, I just couldn't get it. I couldn't get it, and no one told me.
It's also, whilst there is a place for that type of work you were doing at ECH, in terms of becoming a rounded building surveyor, particularly when you're training for your APC, having that breadth of experience, having that ability to take a construction from start to finish is key. And I remember when I was at Davis Langdon, I did some work experience beforehand with a chap called Neil Hamilton, great guy. Went back in and was dropped into fit out under Barry Hayden. And a similar approach, it was sink or swim's the wrong term, but it was, you're trusted from day one. Trust but verify. Here's your small fit out. It's yours. Run with it. You're attending meetings. But what that meant is within 2 years, you've got a diary that's brimming with experience. Cradle to grave, which unfortunately others didn't get because they were dropped into different parts of the business that didn't allow that. From a project perspective,
you were given the whole thing, and you sort of say it's sink or swim. But I very much felt supported. There's a couple of guys that were there, a chap called Matthew Gosling and a chap called Jamie O'Brien, and they were, I think they were associates at the time, and they sort of, you felt very supported by them. They sort of taught you in the right way. They gave you enough rope to sort of feel that you were responsible for it, but they would pull you back in if it wasn't quite right, and if you did some work that wasn't quite where they wanted it to be, they would pull you up in a constructive way, and all those kind of things just helped very much to create a sort of a well-rounded building surveyor, and a well-rounded building surveyor, not just technically, but well-rounded in terms of how you deliver your advice, how you deal with clients, how you talk to other surveyors on the phone, and things that are more difficult in the sort of in the way that we've evolved to work now. I remember if you were going to phone another surveyor, they wouldn't let you go into another room. You had to stay in the main office so that everyone listened to you make that call, which was enormously daunting to start off with, but makes complete sense. And likewise, if they were making a call, they stayed in the office. So you just have the opportunity to listen. Yeah, you listen to how they're speaking.
Because I still think there's a fundamental, especially in the younger profession, a dislike for phoning people. They would much rather sit behind a keyboard, and I think, and I could ever understand that. But I think for me that goes back to being in a call center. I spent years talking with other people, listening to my phone calls, and actually you realise that people aren't really listening. They're too busy doing their own thing. But I see it time and time again. I get an email, and I just think a phone call would have solved that in 5 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, this is true to every part of life, isn't it? But you can't get nuance and tone, and people interpret emails almost in the way that they feel about it rather than the way that you feel about it. I think that I'm really sort of passionate about learning by osmosis. You just get a sense for how people carry themselves, and I think as you kind of go through life and you get more experience, you can decide whether how that person is acting is the way that you want to act. And I think that I was quite fortunate in the two people that I worked the most closely with carried themselves in ways and in qualities that I still hold true today. In the way that they deal with clients, but also in the way that they deal with colleagues. And particularly, Jamie O'Brien went on to be my boss for many years at Malcolm Hollis. He was an excellent boss, and also sort of just a thoroughly nice guy. And I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot from the way that he treated people, from the way that he supported people, and also the way that he dealt with clients. Malcolm Hollis just had that great way of giving you sort of genuine responsibility early on in your career, but supporting you as well. And I think that move to Malcolm Hollis was sort of probably one of two key decisions in my career that led to where I am now. And it also meant that I joined in January of 2006 and passed my APC in November of 2006. So I was there for 11 months. So I ended up being sort of two and a bit years into my career, and and passing my APC, and I don't believe I would have done that if I hadn't made the move over. So I got chartered in November 2006, and then continued to sort of work at Malcolm Hollis in Manchester. And as it was at the time at Malcolm Hollis, it was very dilapidation biased work. And I enjoyed the labs. It gives you gives you a great technical basis of looking at building and understanding defects. But I also really enjoyed the application of case law, and I really enjoyed the sort of the tactics of commercial negotiations that went around it. And I think that those commercial negotiations and the application of case law is probably ultimately why I have ended up specialising in rights of light. As I got chartered there in from 2006, I don't remember specifically how it happened, but the chap at Malcolm Hollis that looks after rights of light is a guy called Ian McKenna. Thoroughly nice guy. I don't know if he asked around the company or if he specifically asked me. I can't remember, but I ended up helping him on a big rights of light job up in Newcastle. And that was my first rights of light job, my first sort of experience of it. And it ran for about 2 years. And throughout that 2 years, with Ian's support, I went from not knowing anything about rights of light to, by the end of 2 years, being kind of reasonably competent. And being reasonably competent at rights of light puts you in the top small percent of chartered surveyors, because it's niche. A very rare discipline. Yeah, very rare discipline. I mean, I went to university in Scotland where there is no rights of light, so it was never mentioned at university. So yeah, it puts you in a pretty niche position. But I really enjoyed it because I enjoyed the sort of technical side of it, but then I enjoyed the kind of application of case law. The kind of when you come up against problems, is thinking about the applications of precedents in the past. And then I enjoyed the commercial negotiation side of it as well. I enjoyed trying to resolve problems, trying to agree settlements with other surveyors. I've been in Manchester for since 2004 to 2008, and I got itchy feet again. Not with Malcolm Hollis, because I was still really enjoying work there, but I got itchy feet with the UK. I'd always kind of envisaged that I wanted to see what it was like working in a different country. I'd spent sort of 3 or 4 months in another country earlier on. We didn't touch on this actually when I was at university up in Edinburgh. I ended up playing rugby for a team in Sweden.
How?
I played for the university for a little bit. I went and played for a team called Boroughmuir, who were in the Scottish Premiership. I didn't play for their first team, but I sort of flirted around the seconds and the third. I would like to say that I played scrum half. I would like to say that the scrum half for the first team was Mike Player, who was he was a scrum half for Scotland at the time. I'd like to say that he was kept out of the team, but in reality, I think they probably would have asked the props to play scrum half before they'd asked me. They had a sort of exchange program. This Swedish Premiership team they were called Enköping, and they were sort of looking for 1 or 2 players to come over and play with them. And obviously, because the winters are pretty cold in Sweden, their seasons are the reverse of ours. So they kick off at the very start of the summer and play through till September. So I went over there, and they were looking, I think I was sort of fortunate, they were looking for a scrum half and a prop, I think, at the time. So they flew me out, and I had a trial, and they said, yeah, we'd like to keep you for the season. So I played out there, and they got us a flat. They got us some bikes to ride to and from training on, but mine got nicked. And then they set us up with a job during the day. So we used to work on a farm packing hay bales during the day, and then sort of get back and train at night, and then play on the weekends.
Was this in the holidays whilst you were at uni? Was this at the same?
Yeah.
So
right. Yeah, so it's because their season ran through. I ended up coming back late to start my second year, because the season ran on until I think it was the end of September. So I think I missed the first sort of 2 or 3 weeks of the start of term. But other than that, it was the whole summer. I think it was a really good experience. the standard of rugby, in Sweden, it was the Swedish Premiership, but there were effectively only 2 leagues. And the standard rugby was okay. It was probably the right kind of level for me. But it was just a great experience to kind of play in a different country. And it kind of gave me a bit of a taste for not just travelling, because I've done a bit of travelling, but actually going over and getting a sense of what it's like to live in another country. And I think those 4 months gave me a bit of a taste for doing that. So I'd been working at Malcolm Hollis for a couple of years, and I'd got chartered there, and I started thinking to myself, I'd quite like to go and work abroad and see what it's like. And I knew a few people that had worked in Australia as chartered surveyors and come back. So I started asking them, who did you work for and what was it like and so on. And through those conversations, I got put in contact with a company over in Australia, and I applied for a job there and got offered a job in Australia. I went back to Malcolm Hollis and said, "Listen, I love working here, but I just want to try. I just want to try working in Australia for a bit, and it might be a year, it might be longer, but I don't know. But I feel like I just sort of I want to try. Yeah, it's an itch that I wanted to scratch. So I wanted to try working over there. So they were good about it. They sort of said, that's it's a shame, but okay. And then as we sort of got nearer to the time, I had this job offer over in Australia, and I can't remember the company, and it'll become apparent why I can't remember the company. But I had this job offer, and I was, the company in Australia was sort of saying, we've chatted to you over the phone, but we don't necessarily know that much about you, and so we don't want to pay you a massive salary. And it was a pay cut to go over there, and I was a bit hesitant about that because I had a mortgage on a flat I bought, and whilst I could rent it out, it didn't quite cover the mortgage, and so there was going to be a shortfall, and that made me a little bit nervous. And so a couple of weeks before I was due to go, I had a call from someone like Hollis, and they said, what we'd really like to do is we'd like to pay you a retainer on the basis that we'll pay you this retainer on a monthly basis, that when you do come back, you come back and work for us. Wow, that's like,
where do I sign
here? That's like free money, and it was great because it covered the shortfall with my mortgage. So it made the whole thing just a little bit easier on the decision. So they said, yeah, we'll pay you this retainer. I was like, fantastic. I'd never really considered if I was coming back that I'd want to work anywhere else. And the kind of detail around it was woolly in terms of, how long they might pay it for. But anyway, who was I to say no? So I said, yes, please, that would be great. And then I got closer and closer to the move to Australia. And then I had another call from them, and they said, why don't you just work for us in Australia? And I thought, that's an interesting prospect. The idea of working remotely just didn't really exist in sort of 2008. We at GIA, we've got consultants that work all over the world. But it was an alien sort of concept there. They said, why don't you work for us? And I thought, yeah, fantastic. My knowledge of rights of light had been growing, and I taught myself CAD at university and kind of kept that up. So they said, we could effectively create a 24-hour rights of light service where you could be working on stuff during the day in Australia, and then you could hand it over to people in the UK who would carry on working on it.
Oh, so you're servicing London or UK-based clients, but
yeah,
interesting. Okay,
we'll pay you what you're getting paid now, and so it doesn't really matter where you live in Australia. So this is fantastic. So I said absolutely yes. I sort of turned down the job in Australia, and they were shirty about it, to be honest. But I ended up going over there and actually just working remotely for Malcolm Hollis. I spent a year over there, sort of travelling around. I spent 3 months in Melbourne and then effectively 9 in Sydney.
And was that, working from a flat or a hostel, on your laptop?
Because I was earning, a sort of, a proper salary as it was at the time. I had a flat, so I had a flat share with a sort of family friend in Melbourne, and my girlfriend, now wife, came with me, and we stayed in that flat, and then we moved over to Sydney. And I mentioned at the very outset that one of the guys that I'm friendly with at university is now in Australia. He came with us. So the 3 of us got a flat in Sydney and lived there for 9 months. And he's never left. He's married to an Australian lady now. He's got kids over there. We went to Sydney, and again, I found a rugby club over there, and then played in Australia for a team called Waverley out in Bondi while I was there. Yeah, I had a great time. As we got into it for about a year, Malcolm Hollis called and said, "We need you back now," which was fairly understandable, to be honest. But you've done what you can do out there, and now really we want you back. And because my girlfriend and I were living with one of my friends from uni, we didn't really feel that settled. And I do sort of wonder if at the time, if we got a flat on our own, if we might have felt quite differently. But it did feel a little bit like we were kind of going back to being a student. And I didn't really want that anymore. I'd been through that. And so Malcolm Hollis said, it's time to come back. So after a year, we came back to the UK, and I went back to Malcolm Hollis. So then I sort of went from what had been maybe largely full-time rights of light over there through into the sort of recession in sort of 2010 onwards, and I didn't do any rights of light at all. There was the business had no rights of light work on whatsoever because there was no development happening.
No new schemes coming through.
No new schemes coming forward. So I reverted back to Delapse. Malcolm Hollis actually grew through the recession because Delapse was so strong of companies downsizing or moving in the recession meant that Delapse grew quite strongly. So I was always very busy there, but it meant that my rights of light work effectively dried up for a couple of years. Nothing but Delapse. So sort of through from 2009, 2010 and onwards. And it was only maybe really in 2012 that sort of development started back up again a little bit tentatively, and then my sort of rights of light workload grew as I was as sort of development came back online. But throughout that time, I'd been kind of progressing my career, and I'd gone from sort of chartered surveyor, senior chartered surveyor, and associate and onwards, and then I'd got more and more involved in rights of light, and then in 2014. I got made a partner at Malcolm Hollis. And at the time, it was an LLP model, and they had what they called fixed equity partners. So I became a fixed equity partner at Malcolm Hollis in May 2014. So I sort of progressed from coming in as a relatively fresh-faced grad in 2006, albeit I had my experience at E.C. Harris before, through to fixed equity partner in May with a year in Australia. I'd kind of gone through the ranks at Malcolm Hollis, and I'd always felt challenged and supported while I was there, and I'd never even come into my thinking that I might want to leave. And naturally, I'm very aware that all the time people get offered jobs and think about leaving, and you can't stop people being offered other jobs. You just got to make sure that when other jobs offers are made, they don't want to take them. So that's all you can. That's the only thing that's within your control. And I'd got to partner stage in Malcolm Hollis, and it was a bit of a turning point for Malcolm Hollis as a business. They'd grown a lot, and I think when I joined, there were about 60 people, and when I eventually ended up leaving, they were probably 350.
A big change.
Big change, a big cultural change in the business, and not a lot of the cultural things that were great about the business remained, and so I wasn't necessarily sort of put off by that, but I'd noticed the change, and in being a partner, it's something I always worked towards, and kind of I'd been desperate to get to, and maybe once I'd got there, there's almost an element of sort of,
is this it?
Yeah, almost a bit sort of anticlimax of thinking, well, what do I do now?
I think going back to that part sort of in time, I think you came into the market in 2004. I came into the market, I think, in 2009. I was the same. There was a very, very clear career path. It was you're a graduate, you become a project surveyor when you become chartered. And if you're really good and you do this, then you can become partner. And I was the same. Back in the day, my focus was I could see Barry Hayden, partner of Fit Out. That's it. That's the pinnacle. But I think part of that is at that point in time, you don't know anything else. That's your world becomes quite, these are the people you surround yourself with day to day.
Yeah.
And I also think that you don't really understand what that partner role entails at that point in time. You only see from the outside, what they do.
You naturally look up to them as you're kind of coming through your career. You look up to the partners and think, blimey, these guys are brilliant. And one day, if I work really hard, I would love to be like them. I remember, I told people about this now. I remember when we had the Christmas party at Malcolm Hollis, you'd look at the table plan, and if you were sat next to a partner, you'd be like, oh God, no. Well, this is what am I going to do? They're going to think I'm an idiot. I can't be myself, and so on. Have this sort of weird status, and then you get made a partner, and then you kind of think, well, they're actually just all just normal. Like me. Yeah, they're just normal, and that in itself is a bit of an anticlimax. And it's not to say that they're not great at what they do, and they're not that they're not all great people. But when you then sit amongst them, it's difficult to know what's to look up to next and what's the next move for you. And I'd been kind of wrestling with those thoughts for a while of what is next. And I got a call out of the blue from a recruiter actually, and he sort of said, we've got this sort of interesting prospect. We're looking at a London-based firm who are keen to open a Manchester office, and sort of in my research I found you, etc. They're a rights of light firm. Would you be interested in having a conversation about working for them? And I said, no way. I said, I'm a sort of fixed
equity partner.
Yeah,
I don't need a job.
Exactly that. I don't need a job. I've got one, and I said, but actually, what I'm interested in is I am interested in starting my own business. And he said, okay, leave that with me, and I'll come back to you. And I didn't really think anything else of it. And then about a month later, I got a call and said, we've been thinking about this, and we think there might be something in it. Okay, right, let's have a chat. So I went down to London and I met him, and then I met a chap. I think he was at FD at the time at GIA. He's not there anymore, but I met this chap and had a chat about it. And we kind of thrashed around some ideas, and we landed on this sort of model where they effectively said, I tell you what, let's start a new business. You take half, we'll take half, we'll cash flow it, and we will guarantee your salary for 3 years, and we'll let you grow the business, and we'll support you, and we'll provide you technical support, etc. for that, and we'll see how it goes. And I thought, wow, this is
great opportunity.
This is like sort of a relatively risk-free way of starting my business, and that was GIA, and they were big name in rights of light only in London at the time, and I knew of them because I was sort of specialising in rights of light, but the wider industry in Manchester and outside of London, I don't think many people knew who GIA were. We started this business, and effectively it was GIA North LLP, but we traded under the GIA banner. So for sort of all intents and purposes, we were
one team,
one dream. GIA, one team, one dream. Absolutely. 2 weeks before I was due to finish at Malcolm Hollis, I had a call from Planner in Manchester, and he said, I've got a couple of jobs I'd like to send you. And I said, well, I'm leaving Malcolm Hollis, so I won't be able to do them for you. And he said, well, I tell you what, you've been recommended to me, not Malcolm Hollis. So he said, give me a call in a couple of weeks.
I'll speak to you in 2 weeks.
So that's exactly what happened. This was October-ish 2015. And 2 weeks later, the first phone call I made on the first day that I sat at my desk at GIA North was to him. And that was transformational in terms of so much work from a timing point of view. I couldn't have been any luckier from that timing. I'd made the decision to make the move, and I'd done all that. So, it's not luck from that point of view, but the timing of that call was just immensely lucky. So there was sort of the kind of equal measure of sort of the hard work, and then the luck just meant that from the very start, there
was momentum from
day one. We basically flew. I remember on the first day that I started at GIA, we had an office up in Manchester. Sort of, I got in there and I went off and bought myself some breakfast. I bought myself a box of cereals, went in, sat at the desk and thought, I've not got any bowls or cutlery. So I had to go out and buy bowls and cutlery and everything. So it was literally sort of, I got the buzz of starting my own business that I'd always kind of craved. And then from sort of that point in 2015, we grew and grew. We sort of went from just me and my cereal box through to by about 2019, 2020, probably, we had about 20 people. And we were consistently growing, and we kind of grew all the way through. The guys in London, who I developed a relationship with them, but they largely left me alone, to be honest. We started talking more and more about what might be next. Gordon Ingram was the founding partner of GIA, and he was starting to think about what succession plans might be for the business. We started those conversations fairly informally, and then they developed more and more into how the businesses might come together and how and what the future might look like for the sort of the newly incorporated entity of GIA North and GIA down in London. We looked at various kind of models of buyouts and earn-outs and sort of various bits. And we settled on a solution, and we ended up with some private equity investment. And effectively, we kind of back-to-backed all the deals where we sort of merged together, and then 30 seconds later, the newly merged entity effectively took investment from private equity. That deal completed in October 2023. And throughout all those conversations of while we were talking about succession and what it might look like and what a new leadership team might look like, Gordon and I had been discussing, and I think we sort of landed on that he thinks that I should be the chief exec for the new business. It was a sort of challenge that I think I was really looking forward to in kind of next step. And I thoroughly enjoy growing my own business, but it's a weirdly lonely place when you're the only owner of the business, because London left me alone. And you get to this pinch point in business size where you get to sort of 20 people. And we didn't really have any systems. We didn't have an accounts department. We didn't have an HR department, and it was just frankly too much for me to keep in my own head. And we're the private equity investment for GIA has allowed us to look closely at acquisitions. I'm sort of reasonably confident that we're getting pretty close to. But it's such a familiar story that I've come across in talking to owners of businesses that are thinking about what's next for them, that they get to this sort of 20 size, 2.5, 3 million turnover, and they just look for support.
It's almost, I'm going to argue, a different skill set from a management perspective. It goes from, you're involved day to day in every job. You're part of that. You then, if you go above, and I actually think it's less than 20, I'd probably say it's kind of 15 and upwards almost, that your job is to ensure that, the systems and processes are in place to support those people that are doing that role. And if you don't bring those systems in place, you become that block of growth. Or you do grow, but actually your service then lacks, and therefore again stifles growth.
Yeah.
And I can see that as a challenge for you, a natural progression almost.
Particularly the sort of the lack of structure, and for anyone that was sort of thinking about starting a business now, I would really implore them to think about scale and think about how they might scale. And you don't. It doesn't mean that you necessarily need to go out and get the most complex ERP system in the world. You do need to think about what your end strategy is and how you might set up that business, and whether the end strategy is scale, or whether the end strategy is eventually an MBO, or whether it's just to run the company and retire. But you do think about those ways, because you can make your life easier from the outset if you think about what the end goal is. And I didn't really do that. I just sort of, I was sort of so excited to be kind of sitting there with my cereals on day one. I never really thought about what sort of 3 years or 5 years might look like. So I got to that kind of bottleneck of, I don't really have any scalable systems. I can't be HR department, accounts department, and still give the level of service that I want to give. So something had to change. So that's why the conversations with the wider GIA business were really welcome. And then it gave me the idea of what might be next and what the future might look like. We came together as a group into a single entity in 2023, and then since then, I've been finding my feet. I've been gone from a business of sort of 20-ish in North, where I knew the other partners pretty well in London, but I didn't really know the wider team very well. Mm-hmm. I've come into this business of sort of 145 people, and been working over the last year and a half to get to know everyone, to think about which bits of my leadership style that I had at the smaller business translate well to a bigger business, and also, frankly, which parts of my leadership style from a smaller business need improving coming through into a bigger business. Because there are differences, and there are some skills that translate enormously well, and the sort of the emotional intelligence and the empathy of telling everyone that I got a massive tip, their skills, that sort of learning moment for me, their skills that translate well into any job you can do. And so, bringing those qualities was good, but the sort of the level of communication that's needed from a small business to a bigger business is just completely different.
And the sophistication of that communication.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're dealing with so many different personalities that not necessarily people that I recruited. I mean, up in Manchester, I'd recruited everyone, so I knew everyone's sort of personality style that I'd almost kind of sought out. And there was a huge different array of personalities in London just because of the sheer size of the place, and it's kind of finding a style or being adaptable enough in your style to still get your point across to people. That's been probably the sort of the biggest learning experience for me over the last 18 months is having an adaptable enough style to keep people engaged, all sorts of different people, keep them engaged. And there are things that I've carried through from my whole career of sort of why I didn't like the kind of work that I was doing at EC Harris, through to why I felt so engaged in the kind of work that I was doing at Malcolm Hollis, and making sure that people understand the why and they see the process and they get the bigger picture, and just sort of helps them be a better consultant if they understand everybody's challenges.
Absolutely. And that big part of that is, as you said before, is empathy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so over the last sort of 18 months at GIA, we've spent a long time sort of thinking about what the business might look like in 5 years' time. And we've spent a long time trying to change some of the way that things were done in the past. That so technical staff in GIA have such a phenomenal base of knowledge that I'm happy to say that they are pretty much universally better at rights of light and daylight and sunlight than I ever was, which is fantastic. But it's also helping them to understand what it takes to run a business, and helping them sort of elevate and progress through their own careers. That if me and some of the shareholders got hit by a bus tomorrow, are the people that have the right level of understanding to carry on running the business. It's hard to find the balance of what might come across as additional burden. So, I now want you to look at your WIP pretty closely, where you never have done before. Is perhaps people thinking, well, I never did that before. Why do I have to do it now? But it is that. And if you want to grow through your career, it does come to a point where being absolutely technically brilliant maybe isn't enough to get you right to the sort of very top.
Part of that. It's completely right. It's the soft skills around that. Soft skills, leadership skills, communication skills,
business understanding, but being able to take that sort of financial technical knowledge, make it understandable and meaningful, and make it engaging. Because whilst I'm sort of I'm now sad enough to find the subject of WIP thoroughly interesting. I don't, understandably, many other people in the business, and I sort of, as my career has kind of evolved from a graduate going out doing condition surveys to now at the point where nearly all of my time is taken up with the running of the business. I am sort of, it's partly sort of a bit nerdy to say, but also a bit of a badge of honour to say that I do thoroughly enjoy how a business ticks, and I find it really interesting, and it's sort of that we are consultants, and we are all people and human beings, and you need to find that blend between financial metrics and people's careers, and that's always the most difficult balance between it, is kind of understanding when and where you can maybe expect a bit more from people, and when and where you maybe know to pull back a bit and think, I've probably asked enough there, or I'm asking too much in that one area. Whilst I acknowledge it might mean that a metric might be completely, might be much better. I have to know what the right balance is. People aren't, it's not a production factory where you can turn up the speed or turn it down according to what you need to deliver that day. People have their own aspirations and their own ambitions and their own personal lives and their own challenges, and you can't expect everything from everyone all of the time. And so it's important that it's the time to ask more, and when the time to hold back is a very important part of leadership. I read a quote, and maybe you can sort of find who the person was, but it was an ex-pro American basketballer. And I remember he had a quote where he said, "Sometimes your teammates push you, and sometimes you pull your teammates." And I really like that, because it is sort of, it's a bit like showing up every day is important, but not every day is 100%. And some days in leadership, you're the one that's pushing things forward, and then other days, the people around you might be the day that you're getting pulled a little bit, and I think that's okay.
Agreed, and I think there's having the emotional intelligence and lack of ego to embrace that, and I think that's, and if your team know that, then I think that encourages great behaviour.
Giving people the space to surprise you, I think, is a good thing. We have this thing at GIA that introduced called Share Your Ideas. It's one of our core values, and Share Your Ideas is a scheme where we allocate some money for members of the business, so fee earning or sort of whatever department they're in, it doesn't matter, but to come forward with ideas that they think will help drive the business forward, whether it's
fantastic,
whether it's process driven, whether it's a fee earning or whatever it may be. And we open this competition. It's currently open for this year at the moment, so submissions are kind of coming through, and the level of thought that people give to it is incredible. It's great for them to be able to feel like there's a platform for them to bring their ideas forward. But from a business point of view, it's fantastic for the business as well.
It's say doing half your job for you, but what it is, but it's more than that. It's about ensuring that your team feel safe, trusted, empowered to make suggestions that may or may not work. As where you are now at the top, you're not having those daily frontline conversations, with customers. You can't possibly know the nuances that and the innovations that need to happen to improve those processes, because you are now 2, 3, 4 steps removed from them. So it's imperative for a business, if you are going to continually innovate, to have that knowledge come through your team, and not all businesses do that.
So we have an in-person practice meeting in I think it's in start of May this year, where the people from the year before present what they've done, and it's sort of, and then the people for the coming year talk about what they're going to do. And I've seen what the guys that had the idea last year and have brought forward have done, and they've created a whole new service for the business, and not only that, they've been away and they've written their own piece of software that does it, and it's just absolutely phenomenal. I'd have absolutely no idea how to do that. I can't write software. I haven't got a clue. I'm forever surprised by the innovation that people can make if you give them a platform to do it.
I mean, it's almost the ultimate succession planning from day one. You're turning the business and empowering every individual within that business to be the potential future leader of the business, and they're rehearsing the skills from day one.
Absolutely, and it's sort of it's a strange transition to. I found it a strange but enjoyable transition to make, where you come from having a hand in everything that a business is doing, on to the sort of the smallest detail. When I was running the Northern business, I was doing everything. I was spinning all the plates. To come into this role, and I mean, this is a bit sort of broad in terms of the summary, because there's always things to do. But I'm not necessarily. No one gives me things to do. I don't necessarily wake up in the morning and think I've got four reports to write today, which I would have done previously. Taking the time to think about things like share your ideas and other other things that we've implemented. When you make that transition from a fee earner to leadership, it can initially think like you're not being productive or you're not doing the right thing, because you get to the end of the day and you're like, well,
you don't have that daily physical output you've had throughout your entire career that you've been measured by, typically.
Yeah, exactly that. And I see it a lot from people, get moved up to leadership roles, that they struggle with not reverting back to their day to day in,
core competency.
You're the head of the service. You probably shouldn't be out doing a delapse in Norwich. And I know that you get the comfort of, you get home and you sit on the sofa and go, big day, I've been driving all day and I've done an inspection, and you've got something tangible in front of you. Sometimes I get home and my kids say, "What have you done today?" And sometimes it's hard to just sort of say. All my kids really know is that in our London office we've got an absolutely enormous fish tank, and it's a real sort of cultural talking point of not just the people in the office, but also you meet clients and other consultants out, and they go, "Oh, how are the fish?" And really, I think that's all my kids are interested in, is when I see them, is they just go, "Did you see the fish today, Daddy? How are the fish going on?" Because they're not really interested if I've spent a couple of hours on some sort of critical thinking that I previously would have done before. So that transition of different outputs is difficult as well, in trying to give yourself permission to have the space to think. A different way of almost organising your day and organising your week, and I do that now. I try and give myself space to think, and I try and be protective of those, and I try and get into routines and habits that give me space to think. And there's all sorts of science behind, which I'm sure in terms of when your brain is in different modes,
when you're most productive.
When you're most productive.
For me, it's I'm definitely a morning person. Earliest I can get to my desk, the better. Because after lunch, I'm just not at my best. So I ensure my high output critical tasks are done in the morning. If I can push meetings and other tasks to the afternoon, that works well for me. That's a really interesting point. So in terms of, I'm going to say, for other leaders listening, what would you say? Let's say hacks is the wrong term, but some of the key things that you ensure that you're doing on a weekly basis that kind of means that you're at your best.
Some of these I've sort of developed myself, and I don't, I'll tell you them as they come to me, rather than having a list of things that I think about that I necessarily know. But so some of these I've evolved myself, and other ones I've frankly nicked from other people. I actually still live up in Manchester, and I commute down to London, so I do sort of 2 or 3 days a week in London, and unless it's absolutely chucking it down, I will walk from Euston to our office near Waterloo. It's about 40 minutes, but it gives me the best space to think about what's coming up that day, what sort of challenges we're dealing with at the time. I just find it really valuable. So I will try and I'll always stick to that. Like I say, unless it's absolutely chucking it down, I will always walk. That's almost the good thing about that space is it's very difficult for anyone to intrude on that.
Your phone's in your pocket. You haven't got a screen in front of you.
Yeah, so that's part of the process. What I nicked from someone else, which I find really good, is I will have sort of email power hours. I won't look at my emails repetitively through the day. I'll allocate time to do them, and when an email comes in, you only touch it once. So you only touch it once, in that you either sort of read it and delete it, or you delegate it, or you action it. And other than that, you don't leave emails dwelling in your inbox. And so I'm sort of, my email habits around that are quite good, that I don't have,
1,000 emails.
That makes me feel. That makes me feel.
I'm the same in terms of OCD, a clean inbox.
And other things that I felt have been really helpful for me is turning off notifications. I don't have an Apple Watch. On my phone, I don't have any notifications that come up. So if I've got an email, I won't know unless I open the email box. I just find it breaks your chain of thought. And if you are sort of allowing yourself that time of kind of free thinking, having things interrupt you. If you set yourself that hour, but you've got WhatsApps pinging up on your watch, or you've got emails pinging up on your computer the whole time, that's not an hour well spent. That's not an hour spent doing anything. You're not being productive in your thoughts or responding to those notifications. So I think trying to be disciplined in how you're spending your time, is really important. So that for me would be allowing yourself the space to think, because that's really where, as leaders, you bring the most value. I'm not me sort of going out and doing a rights of light report isn't where I bring value. Within the business, there are dozens of people that are fantastically doing that, but that's not my role, and my role is different from that. And if I spend the time to think about the share your ideas scheme, and then a year later we've got a brand new service that some other people have thought about, there's sort of can bring exponential amounts of value than sort of responding to emails here and there. So I think being disciplined in where you put your time is certainly the biggest thing for me. I joined a CEO group. There's a chap called Steve Bell, who's the chief exec of Turley, and we became chief execs at very similar time. And Turley are a slightly bigger business than GIA, but the way that we landed in our roles was quite similar. And we had a couple of meetings when we first came into the role. We just sort of chat about how we're getting on, and how do you deal with this and how do I deal with that. And I found it really useful to have someone else as a bit of a sounding board of those kind of ideas, and they didn't know the business well enough to know exactly the people you're talking about or whatever the problems were or so on. So you felt you got this really good impartial advice. And we met a couple of times, and I was sort of trying to arrange to meet with him the third time, and he disappeared, and I was like, why isn't Steve talking to me anymore? I kind of need this. I've joined a sort of a formal group called Vistage, which I think lots of people will have heard of Vistage. So I joined a Vistage group, and we meet once a month. There's 10 people in our group, and they're all sort of, whether they're MDs or chief execs or whatever their title is, that they're all effectively running businesses, and the businesses are a variety of sizes. We all do completely different things. It's really helpful and really interesting to be able to take the time to speak to other people that have the same universal challenges.
It comes back to sort of learning by osmosis,
yeah,
and picking up nuances from other leaders in completely different sectors, things that you might never have thought of or know, or come across.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many similar challenges that people have, in whether they're, whether they're cultural, whether they're financial, or whatever it may be. Those things translate universally between businesses. And so, having the opportunity to kind of throw ideas around with other people that have the same sorts of challenges, I found really helpful. I guess the sort of final one is, we've touched on it in our sort of various themes as we've been speaking, but I think it's the potential to reflect and adapt if you didn't do things right, is to have the right level of mindset where you can acknowledge yourself. I didn't do that as well as I think I could have done, and next time I'm going to do it differently. And I think it's having the awareness to evolve your style, even though you've made it to the top. It doesn't mean I'm the best version of me that I can be. And I think, I would certainly acknowledge that I'm a better leader now than I was 18 months ago. And I will hope that in 18 months I'll be a better leader again.
I think that's a really nice place to end it today. I've thoroughly enjoyed today. Thanks ever so much for coming on, Sam. We'll get you back on again in a year's time or so and chat through what you've been working on.
Feels like a serious accountability, Steve, that I'm going to have to make sure that...
I'm sure that's part of your Vistage kind of stuff anyway.
Absolutely.
In terms of accountability.
Love accountability.
Really enjoyed that, Sam. Thanks ever so much. And we'll speak again soon.
Steve, thanks for having me. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
This podcast is sponsored by Fidgins, a London-based cost consultancy. Please visit fidgins.co.uk to find out more about our market-leading service and some of the amazing clients we get to work with. We're super open to guest recommendations for this podcast. So if there's anyone in the industry you'd like to get on the show, please visit the website or send me a message on LinkedIn and I'll try to make it happen. Thanks and bye for now.